The blade catches torchlight, not the clean gleam of polished steel meant for swift execution. This is different. Irregular. The edge curves and waves like a serpent's spine, designed not to slice cleanly, but to tear, to rip, to leave wounds that scream. This is not a weapon of mercy. In the medieval world, death was cheap. A sword through the heart, an arrow in the throat. These ended lives efficiently, quietly, without ceremony. But efficiency was not always the goal. Sometimes, the goal was something darker. Terror. Picture a battlefield at dawn. Two armies face each other across a field of mud and last year's bones. The air smells of wet iron and fear. Soldiers grip their weapons. Not just tools of war, but instruments of psychological destruction. Because the generals understand something that modern warfare has forgotten. A man who dies quickly is just one casualty. But a man left alive, screaming, mutilated, his body broken in ways that make other soldiers vomit, he is a weapon himself. He is a message written in flesh. Medieval weaponsmiths were artists of horror. They understood anatomy not just to kill, but to maximize suffering, to create injuries that would fester for weeks, to design implements that would strip a man of dignity before they stripped him of life, to forge tools that, when raised above a crowd, would send civilians fleeing before a single blow was struck. These weapons had names that sound like folklore. The Morning Star, the Raven's Beak, the Man Catcher, the Scold's Bridle, each one engineered not for the efficiency of death, but for the spectacle of agony, for the theater of fear that could break an enemy's will before the battle even began. Because they knew, the lords and generals, the executioners and torturers, that a corpse inspires nothing. It lies still, silent, forgettable. But a man screaming as his bones are crushed inside intact skin? A knight dragged from his horse by a hooked pole, helpless as a caught fish? A woman paraded through town in an iron mask, her tongue pierced by metal spikes? These images burned into memory, traveled through villages like plague, made soldiers desert, made citizens obey. Terror was not a side effect of medieval warfare. It was the strategy. Tonight we examine 10 weapons that were never meant to kill quickly. 10 instruments of psychological warfare forged in the furnaces of human cruelty. Each one a masterpiece of engineering designed around a single principle, that fear is more powerful than death. That a man who believes he will be torn apart slowly will surrender faster than a man who expects a clean end. These are not legends, not myths exaggerated by time. These weapons existed, were used, left behind evidence in bones excavated from mass graves, in legal documents describing punishments, in the tortured imaginations of survivors who lived to tell what they witnessed. The morning star that crushed skulls without penetrating them, leaving men to die over days from brain hemorrhage. The flamberge whose wavy blade created wounds that couldn't be stitched. The man-catcher that transformed armored knights into helpless prisoners, their dignity shredded before a cheering crowd. The Scold's Bridle that didn't kill at all, just transformed women into public warnings, walking symbols of what happens when you speak too loudly. Each weapon tells a story, not of battles won or lost, but of the calculated use of horror as currency, as diplomacy, as law. The blade still catches the light, and in its irregular edge, we see the truth that empires were built on screams as much as steel. Let us begin. The Macahudal, the obsidian nightmare. The weapon looks almost primitive. A flat wooden paddle, roughly the length of a man's arm, embedded along both edges with shards of volcanic glass. Obsidian, black as midnight, sharp enough to split a hair suspended in candlelight. The Aztec warriors called it Macahudal. The Spanish conquistadors who faced it called it something else. The Devil's Own Club. Obsidian is sharper than any steel blade ever forged. Molecular level sharpness, capable of cutting through flesh with almost no resistance. But obsidian is also brittle. It chips, it fractures. And this is not a flaw, it is the design. When the Macahudal strikes, the obsidian doesn't slice cleanly like a sword. It shatters on impact, leaving dozens of microscopic glass fragments embedded deep in the wound. Fragments that cannot be removed, that will migrate through tissue for weeks, causing infections, internal bleeding, agony that compounds with every movement. The Spanish recorded encounters with Aztec warriors wielding these weapons described how a single blow could decapitate a horse, not through clean cutting, but through a combination of impact and the sawing motion of fragmenting glass. Described wounds on their own soldiers that looked as if they'd been mauled by animals. Flesh torn rather than cut, edges ragged and unsuturable. But the Macahutal's true power was not in what it did to bodies. It was in what it did to minds. Imagine being a conquistador, armored in steel that has turned aside countless sword blows, standing across from a half-naked warrior holding what appears to be a wooden paddle embedded with black stones. You feel superior, protected, confident. Then your companion is struck. The sound is wrong. Not the ring of metal on metal, but a wet crunch. Your companion screams. His arm is still attached, but barely, hanging by strips of flesh and tendon, the bone splintered, the wound jagged and weeping. The obsidian fragments glitter in the meat like cursed jewels, and you realize your armor means nothing. Your steel means nothing, because this weapon doesn't fight fair, doesn't cut clean, it mutilates, transforms men into living warnings. The Aztecs understood psychological warfare on an intimate level. Their entire military culture was built around capturing enemies alive for sacrifice, yes, but also around creating such spectacular violence that neighboring cities would surrender rather than face it. The Macahutal was perfect for this. A warrior wielding one didn't just defeat his enemy. He dismantled him, left him alive, screaming, bleeding from wounds that looked like they'd been inflicted by something inhuman. And when word spread through enemy ranks about what these wooden paddles could do, when soldiers saw their brothers returning from battle with arms hanging useless, faces split open, hands missing fingers, all from a weapon that looked like a toy, that was when the terror set in. That was when armies broke. Not from being killed, from being shown what surviving could look like. The obsidian glitters, black as volcanic glass, sharp as nightmares, and still cutting centuries after the last Macahutal was swung. The morning star, the spiked sermon. The priest carries a weapon. This is not unusual. Medieval clergy were often warriors, their vows to God not preventing them from participating in the machinery of violence that kept kingdoms functioning. But the weapon is specific, deliberate. A wooden shaft topped with a spiked metal ball, the morning star. Called such because its radiating spikes resemble the rays of the sun, a poetic name for an instrument of calculated brutality. The morning star does not cut, does not pierce deeply. Its purpose is blunt force trauma delivered through metal spikes that crush and puncture simultaneously. The result is catastrophic and slow. When the spiked ball connects with a skull, the spikes penetrate, but not deeply, just far enough to crack the bone, to create fractures that spiderweb across the cranium. The impact sends shockwaves through the brain. Immediate unconsciousness. But not death. Not yet. The victim wakes hours later, days later, to blinding headaches, to seizures, to bleeding from ears and eyes as the brain swells inside the damaged skull. The death takes time. Days of agony as the hemorrhage spreads, as infection sets in, as the body slowly shuts down from trauma it cannot repair. And throughout this dying, the victim remains conscious enough to suffer. This is the weapon's genius. A sword creates corpses. A morning star creates examples. The clergy favored it not despite its cruelty, but because of it. The church's logic was labyrinthine. They were forbidden to shed blood directly, hence no blades, but crushing bones? Rupturing organs through blunt trauma? Technically permissible. God's loopholes, written in broken bodies. But there was another reason. Deeper. More psychological. When a priest carries a weapon of pain rather than death, when he wields an implement that extends suffering rather than ending it swiftly, He sends a message. Even God's representatives understand that some sins require more than quick execution. They require suffering, require time for the sinner to contemplate his errors while his body betrays him. The morning star became a symbol, not just of clerical authority, but of divine punishment made manifest. Villages would see the priest ride in carrying his spiked mace, and they knew. Someone would be made an example. Someone would take days to die, their screams echoing through the town square, a sermon delivered in agony rather than Latin. And the effect was profound. Peasants who might have rebelled, who might have questioned church authority, who might have hidden grain during tithes, they reconsidered. Because the alternative was not martyrdom, not a quick death that might elevate them to hero status. The alternative was being struck down in the village center, left alive to writhe and bleed from head wounds that never stopped throbbing, skull fractured, brain dying by inches while the entire community watched. The morning star did not kill efficiently. It killed publicly. And in that public spectacle of prolonged death, the church found a tool more effective than any sermon. Fear disguised as righteousness. Violence dressed in holy robes. The spikes catch the dawn light, and somewhere a priest tightens his grip on the wooden shaft, preparing to deliver God's message. One crushed skull at a time. The flamberge, the wavy blade of agony. The sword moves like water. Its edge does not follow a straight line, but undulates in regular waves from hilt to point. The flamberge, named for its resemblance to a flame. Beautiful in an unsettling way. Hypnotic. The kind of craftsmanship that makes you forget, momentarily, that this is an instrument designed to maximize human suffering. The waves are not decorative. When a straight blade cuts, it creates a clean wound. The flesh parts smoothly. Surgeons can stitch it. The body can heal, given time and fortune. But when a wavy blade cuts, it tears. The edge catches and releases, creating a wound with irregular depth, with jagged edges that resist closure. Stitching such a wound is nearly impossible. The flesh doesn't align. The damage extends beyond the visible cut, muscle fibers torn rather than severed, blood vessels shredded in multiple places. The wound festers almost immediately. Infection is not a risk, but a certainty. And the pain is extraordinary. Nerve endings are not cut cleanly but mangled. Every movement pulls on torn tissue. The body cannot adjust, cannot compensate. The agony is constant, radiating, consuming. But the flamberge's psychological impact goes deeper than the wounds it creates. The sound. When a flamberge strikes another blade during combat, the wavy edge creates a distinctive vibration, a rattling, buzzing sound that travels through both weapons. Fighters describe it as unsettling, unnerving, like the sword itself is alive, angry. The vibration travels up the defender's arm, disrupts their grip, makes them hesitate. And in sword combat, hesitation is death. Or worse than death. Because a flamberge wound means dying slowly over weeks as infection spreads and the torn flesh refuses to heal. Means lying in a field hospital screaming while a surgeon tries to debride tissue that has no clean edges to work with. Means eventually succumbing to sepsis, your body rotting from a single strike. The Holy Roman Empire eventually declared the flamberge a war crime. Think about that. In an era where boiling oil was poured on besieging soldiers, where prisoners were flayed alive, where plague-ridden corpses were catapulted into cities. In that era, this sword was considered too cruel for legitimate warfare. Anyone captured wielding one could be executed immediately without trial. But this did not stop its use. It simply added another layer of fear. Soldiers who carried flamberges knew they could expect no quarter if captured. They fought with the desperation of men who had already committed to their own damnation. And their enemies knew this, knew that the man with the wavy blade had nothing to lose, would fight until death, because surrender was not an option. The flamberge transformed combat into something personal, intimate. A man with such a weapon was not just trying to win a battle, he was trying to leave scars, physical and psychological, that would never fade. The blade catches torchlight. The waves ripple like water, like flame, like the edge between warfare and atrocity. A line the flamberge crossed and never looked back. The man catcher, the hook of humiliation. The knight sits tall in his saddle. Knight sits tall in his saddle, steel plate from head to foot, trained since childhood in the art of mounted combat, a weapon of his lord, a symbol of nobility and martial prowess. He charges across the field, lance lowered, invincible, until the pole rises from the infantry line. The man catcher, a long wooden shaft topped with a two-pronged metal collar lined with inward-facing spikes. It looks almost comical, like something designed to catch stray dogs. But when it closes around the knight's neck, when the spikes bite into the vulnerable gap between helmet and breastplate, the comedy ends, and the humiliation begins. The knight is pulled from his horse. Not killed, not wounded necessarily, just dragged. The armor that makes him powerful also makes him helpless. 70 pounds of steel that protects against swords but offers no defense against being hauled bodily across the mud like a hooked fish. He lands hard. The man catcher pins him. He cannot stand. The weight of the armor prevents it. Cannot remove the collar. The angle is wrong. The spikes dig deeper when he struggles. He can only lie there, thrashing, while common soldiers surround him. Soldiers he would not have acknowledged as human hours ago. They strip his armor, piece by piece. The ritual is deliberate, slow. They want him to feel it. The loss of every plate, every symbol of his status peeling away until he is just meat and padding, no different from them. Sometimes they ransom him. Sometimes they do not. But the damage is already done, because every other knight in the battle saw it happen, saw their peer reduced from mounted god to flopping ketch, saw that armor, the expensive, elaborate proof of superiority, meant nothing against a simple pole with a hook. The man-catcher was designed by peasant soldiers who were tired of being trampled, tired of watching knights ride them down and return home as heroes. They could not afford the training to fight knights in single combat, could not afford the armor to match them. But they could afford a long stick and some metalwork, and they could afford the imagination to realize that you do not have to kill a man to defeat him. Sometimes, stripping him of dignity is more effective. The man-catcher spread across Europe not because it was lethal, but because it was demoralizing. It turned the battlefield social order upside down, made nobility vulnerable in a way that was deeply psychological. A knight who died in combat could still be honored. But a knight who was pulled off his horse like a chicken being caught for slaughter, he became a joke. And jokes spread through taverns and market squares, across entire regions. The story of Lord So-and-so, dragged through the mud by peasants with a pole, his ransom paid by embarrassed relatives who wished he had just died cleanly. The weapon did not kill. It